Hello, everyone. Welcome to the the inaugural 2021 edition of Safe Space for White Questions. My name is Alex Khasnabish, and I'm here with my friend, colleague, and co-conspirator, Dr. Ajay Parasram, and we're here to have an engaged discussion with you, as we have been over the last few months. I just want to begin, first of all, by acknowledging that this event and indeed all our lives here are taking place on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory, or at least in our case, we're located in so-called Nova Scotia. And for all those who, like me, are settlers on these territories, I want to acknowledge our collective responsibility to decolonize our lives and our presences here and to learn to live with justice and dignity with the first inhabitants of these territories. I also want to thank our very kind, very patient, and very gifted partners at Fernwood Publishing for supporting in terms of tech support and sponsoring this event. We're so grateful that this is getting out a bit more widely than in the first couple of months that we were doing this using a much more limited platform. And I just want to welcome you all here again. So before we get started on the format, I'm just going to give a brief intro to this really quickly. First, I'll introduce myself. For those of you who haven't been with us before and haven't seen previous episodes of this little initiative, my name is Alex Khasnabish. I am a professor at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax. I am, like I said before, a settler on these particular territories, but I'm a broadly ambiguously racialized person who hails from Toronto, Ontario, originally on Haudenosaunee territories there. I've been in Halifax for about 15 years, and my work focuses on questions like those we'll be talking about today, but specifically, I look at social movements, radical politics, the far right, white supremacy, and fascism. So really happy to be here with you and with Ajay discussing your questions and issues surrounding racial justice, social change. That's what we do here. If you're brand new to this, then that's my very quick and dirty introduction. This month, I'm taking the lead on things, so I'll be taking the first shot at reading some questions. But first, I'm going to hand it over to Ajay just so he can introduce himself and say hi to you all.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Ajay Parasram. I'm based here in Mi'kmaq, like Alex said. I think of myself as a multi-generational byproduct of the British Empire, which is a big mouthful to describe the fact that my ancestors came from kind of northern India, I think, crossed the waters and became kind of replacement indentured servants on the plantations in the southern Caribbean, and then I've lived and worked across Turtle Island, Coast Salish territories, Algonquin territories, and now here in Mi'kmaq. I work on issues of race, critical race theory. The colonial present is how I kind of bookend all of my work, and within that is some of this work, exciting work on building racial resilience. So really excited to take your questions, and would encourage you to check out our past issues as well. And just one quick public service announcement before we go is that tonight is also the Viola Desmond Legacy Lecture. And you can check that out if this is something we're going to have. Michelle Odette going to be delivering that lecture this afternoon at 3:00, and you can check that out on Dalhousie's website. So some more programming going on this subject. So back to you, Alex.
Great, thanks, Ajay. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, rejoining us after several of these different episodes, I'll just give you a brief rundown on how this works. Once again, we're inviting your questions really at any time, either now or in advance of our sessions. You're welcome to write them in and ask them anonymously. We do try to get through all the questions we get, and Ajay and I are just going to go back and forth in terms of reading them out and answering them. So yeah, please feel free anytime within the next few days. If you have a question coming out of this session, you're welcome to leave it for us for the next session. We aim to do these on a monthly basis. That's how it's been working so far. Last Wednesday of every month, we're here at this time. So we hope you can keep joining us. All right, without any further ado, I'm going to jump into it here. So we have our first question is, As a white settler, we own a house in rural Ontario, still mortgaged, and a few acres around it. As a family, we've worked hard, blue collar, to be able to have it. Somehow lived most of my life busy with kids and had my head in the sand. I'm not sure what we do to be an ally if this land shouldn't be ours, but we can't afford to give it up. Just trying to learn. Thanks for taking the time. So, great question about the settler colonial nature of our lives here on Turtle Island, on Indigenous territory as settlers. I'll take the first shot at this one. I'm going to say this is a very common concern, I think, and perhaps without being flippant about it, I'm going to give a bit of the same answer that I would give when people ask questions about alternatives to capitalism, which is that the alternatives are not either fully privatized reality or fully communal realities. Nobody wants your toothbrush. In the same way that addressing the enduring violence of settler colonialism doesn't necessarily have to do with you giving up your personal residence and the little plot of land that you exist on. Although some people, I want to point out, have done things like this, and particularly people writing into their wills and returning land that they've lived on to the Indigenous peoples whose territory it originally was. So it's certainly an option. But that said, there are lots of ways to be a good ally that don't involve you giving up, your own home, your own bit of property. And so I would say, depending upon where you are in Ontario, which Indigenous nations do you live in proximity to? What struggles to return the land to those groups do you exist in proximity to and could contribute meaningfully to? So if you're in Ontario, you probably know of the struggle around the Haldeman track, the land back struggle going on right there now in Six Nations. If you don't, and if you're in proximity to Hamilton and Dundas and that kind of area, it's a great thing for you to learn about. Lots of resources online about that. I would also say that just getting to know those issues that animate like your immediate existence, right? So rather than looking for the biggest, grandest demonstration of solidarity, all of which is great and important, just think about, if there are struggles for return of the land, recognition of Indigenous sovereignty, looking to build lines of solidarity between settler and Indigenous peoples in your areas, attend a talk. Look for a group in your area that's doing support work. Find ways to contribute food or supplies. Learn, spend some time on, as much as a cesspool as social media can be sometimes, Twitter actually can be a surprisingly effective resource for some of this, some great resources, people posting on there. I would definitely suggest, if you're in Ontario, though, looking at the Land Back Initiative, Land Back Struggle, and looking at the ways that struggle is bringing in people from outside of, the immediate struggle to it. So people from Black Lives Matter, for example, Desmond Cole's been involved in this struggle and in highlighting the importance of this to broader struggles for racial justice. So you're asking great questions. You're asking the questions you need to. There isn't a singular answer to give you in terms of how you can tap into this. But I would say start modestly, right? Especially if you're new to this, by reaching out and by looking for notices in your own community about what people might be doing to support these struggles. I'm going to turn it over to Ajay to see what his thoughts are on this as well.
Thanks for that, Alex, and thanks very much for this question. I think it's a great one for us to get started with. The only thing I would really add to what Alex said is to reiterate the value of starting small. Nobody is, as far as I can tell, nobody's asking you to leave. You know what I mean? So that's not really the politics, as I understand it, of Indigenous sovereignty and the land back movement. Certainly, some people have decided to, make space on their land or give back some of their land. Not everybody has the capacity to do that. I mean, I know I certainly don't. I also, live in a house that is mortgaged for the first time, like in my late 30s. That was like the first time that we were able to do something like that. So I don't think that that's really what's necessary. But what is necessary is to think about how the state, the settler state in general, based in Ottawa, based in Toronto, if you're in Ontario, etc., all the different facets of it, that is the collective action, the collective voice of settler society. So when we hear calls for land back, when we hear calls to support Indigenous sovereignty, what you could do that's perhaps more significant even than, parting with whatever little piece of land you call home, is to demand of the state that speaks for you and for all of us who are not Indigenous, demand that they take things seriously, like land back, like Indigenous sovereignty, that they don't force resource development projects on people whose territory has been stolen, and that they commit to things like financial reparations for things like slavery on the one hand, or for things like colonization as it affects Indigenous people. These are all things that we can advocate for at that collective level that has huge implications, much bigger than whether or not you have a front lawn, you know what I mean? But then to say one other thing about your front lawn, because I think this could be a really powerful project as well, is if you have the means and the ability, reach out and build some relationships. There's things that you could do with land if you have land, such as maybe working with Indigenous people in your community to cultivate a community garden on your space that privileges Indigenous crops to your area, whatever part of Ontario that you're in. There are lots of really powerful small ways to focus on the land, especially where you have a place on the land. Focus on the land, learn from the Indigenous people in your area. If they want to share that knowledge with you, they may not want to, but reach out and think about how you can use your land creatively at the micro level, and then think at the macro level about demanding that the state that claims to speak for you actually speaks for what you think. Back to you, Alex.
Yeah, so many great suggestions. Thanks, AJ, for that. Some really good concrete places to start, I think. Moving on to our next question. If white male supremacy is the toxic glue that binds, maybe, settler society together, what new binding relationships should replace it for collective liberation? As it stands now, it seems like capitalism is moving to act as a replacement. But beyond that maligned relationship, I fear there is nothing to prevent new oppressive relationships from forming. Wow. So this is like $1 million question wrapped in $1 billion question here. Not to be capitalist about my valuing of the complexity of the question, of course. Yes, so much to get into here. I'm going to try and just take one piece of it. I'm sure AJ will have lots of things to say about this too. First of all, I would agree that as many social scientists and journalists and observers have commented on the place of patriarchy, the place of whiteness in binding the societies that we know in this part of the world, on Turtle Island, and in many other places, are indeed held together by these kinds of relationships. I wouldn't say only by that relationship, but certainly it's a powerful one. I don't know that capitalism is the thing that I would say binds our society together. For me, it's important to distinguish between these elements. Capitalism, certainly more than economics, and certainly provides a set of very dysfunctional, exploitative relationships that we become habituated to. But in many ways, it's overlaid on existing forms of oppression too. So I'm going to stick with the question around white male supremacy here and what might replace it. First of all, I would say the one thing that I always encourage activists and organizers, anybody who cares about social change, to acknowledge and sort of breathe deeply into, is that there is no. It's not like a video game, right? We don't get to the final boss, who is like white, hetero, patriarchal capitalism, settler colonial capitalism, and defeat it, and then we're done. Okay? Any society we build for all time is going to be vulnerable, subject to that slipping into forms of oppressive or exploitative relationships. We're never free of that. Those tendencies, those possibilities are part of our human capacity, right? So goodness, however we want to think about this, good people, bad people, fascism, democracy, all these kinds of things, they are possibilities, and we can't ever guarantee that we will put them to rest forever. That's just something we live with. And in some ways, that's a really good thing, because it means our attempts at social change are always about what we do in the moment in terms of building those relationships that liberate us from forms of oppression and exploitation. They're not about projecting ourselves 100 years, 1,000 years into the future when we finally made it. That said, what replaces it? Well, I mean, I think you're answering your own question in a lot of ways in the way that you pose it, because I think what replaces it are a multiplicity of different options and possibilities. Obviously, societies need norms and values. We need institutions. We need like those common frames. We need to build a culture that allows us to communicate and feel connected to one another. All those kinds of things, right? That's the work of human beings living together. But we do that stuff on a daily basis now, and many of your relationships, I hope anyway, aren't simply beholden to white supremacy, to toxic patriarchy, or to capitalism. It may indeed be that many of those ways of being in the world want you to think about them first and want you to prioritize them, but it doesn't mean much of the work of care and solidarity you're already doing on a daily basis that is indeed co-opted and exploited by these other forms of relations, that they're not there too, right? So I think it's about, but from my perspective anyway, I'm not trying to offer a totalizing answer here. It's about acknowledging the diversity of possibilities there. So, what would we do? Like, let's just take a concrete example about the patriarchal family, right? The nuclear family. What would we replace it with? Well, I mean, I suspect a lot of people would continue to live in something that we look at now and regard as sort of a traditional or conventional family. It doesn't mean those families themselves couldn't be liberated from some of the baggage, the incredibly toxic baggage they're freighted with right now. It doesn't mean you have to suddenly imagine living on a commune or in a house where your kin relations, as they're articulated now, are broken down fundamentally. I think sometimes as radicals and revolutionaries, we imagine having to uproot and destroy everything, rather than simply taking a look at existing forms and saying we can retake that and make it something better and different. So for me, as somebody who's deeply committed to my kin relationships, I don't want to see. I'm not interested in smashing the family, to take a very old 1960s slogan and throw it back into the maelstrom there. I'm interested in deepening, radicalizing, diversifying what we mean by family, right? So families of a multiplicity of kinds, and those become then the basis for our social interactions. So acknowledging the diversity of people's experiences that are already there, right? I mean, you're absolutely correct, I think, in identifying the fact that many of those experiences have been kind of preyed on by these oppressive forms of social institution and relation, but it doesn't mean they don't exist above and beyond that too. So I'm not going to give you a singular answer, because I really can't. I think, in my ideal future, we're going to have lots of different experiments in collective liberation, and it's about us bringing those experiments into conversation with one another. But that said, I'm going to come back to, and this is the last point I'll make, a very old chestnut that I like to rehash every once in a while. I am not a believer in finding some kind of like golden subjectivity that we can all inhabit that will be the same for everyone, or that will mean that we are no longer sometimes lousy people individually to one another. I don't believe that social change is therapy. I don't believe in rehabilitating people, particularly at like sort of the individual psychoanalytic level. You know what I mean? We're still going to have to deal with people who do shitty things to one another interpersonally. We're still going to deal with racists. We're still going to deal with people who have a tendency towards fascism, all those kinds of things, even in our liberated society. The thing about that is we will have a bigger social structure and hopefully institutions and ways of relating to one another that are built in such a way that they are resistant to the predation of those kinds of ways of being in the world, and so will allow us to be a lot more decent to each other at that level of social life. So it's probably a bit of an abstract answer. I'm going to throw it to AJ and see what he has to say about this.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks for that really thoughtful question. I had some time to think about it while Alex was answering, so I'm going to try to be rather direct, actually, and in this. So the one thing I would say, I was really stuck on the use of your word glue, the toxic glue that binds settler society together, and then what can we do in terms of finding that new glue? So kind of like Alex said, there's no single glue, and I think. Of course, this is my attempt at being specific, and I'm going to talk about always becoming. But society is always moving. You know what I mean? There's no single moment in which we can look at society and say this is what it is. And I think that what you'll find, particularly in terms of when we think about how white male supremacy continues to structure society, what a lot of white males with more power than they ought to have love to return to time and time again is various meditations on what human nature is, what the essence of society is. And generally speaking, these aren't people who have devoted their lives to figuring out what human nature is. And, I don't even think that most people who do that for a living could tell you truly what human nature is. But this is how, because you mentioned capitalism, this is the way in which people have been trying to culturally normalize an ethic of capitalism, an ethic of individualism, that really, if you look at it carefully, has been a form of affirmative action for white men for the last 400 years. Because this illusion that, that we compete and then the cream of the crop rises to the top, this has always been basically a project that has advanced the mediocrity of white men above and beyond the kind of fundamental skills and talent of people whose skills are not recognized by a society organized by capitalism. So I think there is something here to what you're saying about the connection between this white toxic masculinity and then the normalization of a capitalist ethic. So, more to the point then of what you're asking, like, what do we do about this? How do we cultivate new ways of forming relationships that are stronger? And I would think of it in terms of if you've ever cared for a garden, you can't just plant a seed and kind of walk away and hope that something will grow unless you happen to live in the Southern Caribbean and you drop a mango seed or something like that. But assuming that you don't live where the land is that lush, and I'll tell you, when we're talking about white supremacy and white male supremacy, the land is not lush. So you have to do a lot of work to cultivate that. So that work takes the form of weeding. That work takes the form of watering the plants. That work takes the form of adding nutrients to the soil. So, you really have to because society is constantly forming and reforming, part of the work of kind of tending for that garden, of creating the new sinews, is going to have to be you deliberately intervening in that toxic white masculinity, particularly if you are a white man, or even if you are just a man in particular. I think it's important to think about how you can do this kind of weeding in your everyday life. One good example that I would use from my own experience has been, just the simple act of attending, barbecue. It's something most people in North America has probably done in some shape or form. There is the natural tendency, in the same way that a weed wants to take root and take over a lawn or take over a garden, the tendency is that you'll see in most middle-class white kind of environments a bifurcation of men and women, quote unquote men and women. And in those spaces, certain kinds of conversations happen that are complicit with the various kinds of toxic masculinity that we're kind of talking about here. One of the things that I've tried to do in those spaces is to force different kinds of conversations just casually, so, crack a beer if you have to, and then right when somebody makes some reference about hockey, maybe change it around to, your favorite trans athlete or something like that. Or and just see what happens, and this is not to be an asshole. This is because what you want to do is you want to make the comfortableness of the patriarchy deeply uncomfortable for other people. And you don't have to do this you don't have to hammer people over the head with it. You say one thing and you can see how the sinew, the glue starts to come away from the conversation. It might not happen right away, might take a few times. And honestly, then you might not get invited to the barbecue anymore. But that's part of the risk of doing this kind of work. So, one tangible example, think about gardening and remember that anybody who tells you that human nature and the development of human society has followed a single trajectory literally does not know what they're talking about. We are always shaping society and reforming society. So back to you, Alex.
Yeah, great answer. I think, AJ, yeah, I really like the gardening metaphor. Absolutely. All right, so a couple more questions here, a little bit shorter. I'm going to go to the first one. How do I talk to my family about conspiracy theories like QAnon? Great question, super topical. Lots of people considering this lately. QAnon particularly, but conspiracies in general seem to really find a lot of fuel for their fires during the pandemic for lots of important reasons. And lots of people want to know how they can talk to loved ones about this. So thanks for that question. I'm going to make a couple of basic suggestions here. So the first one is that it is almost impossible to provide logical or evidence-based arguments aimed at disputing or disproving conspiracy theories. So this is frustrating, right? It's a form of belief that is surprisingly resilient and immune to even those kinds of challenges, because there's always a deeper layer. So let me just give you a quick example, right? You would think that Trump's loss in the U.S. presidential election would mean the end of QAnon, and lots of mainstream reporters, lots of liberal pundits are talking about how QAnon's all done. But if you look a little bit behind the scenes, you'll see that QAnon, while certainly have taken a significant hit, given like the whole narrative of Trump leading this charge against the deep state and this international pedophile ring and all this kind of stuff, seems like it's fallen on hard times since he didn't re-win the presidency. Indeed, this story now becomes no. This is the next layer to the great plan, right? That Biden actually has been put in place in order either to carry on from Trump or Trump's not done. In fact, this was a critical move to. So you see what I mean, right? It's like a completely bogus anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? This this propaganda piece written in the early 1900s that blames Jews worldwide for every imaginable problem. You would think that would be fairly easy to disprove, and indeed it should be. But of course, the people who are drawn to it aren't swayed by the evidence you provide, because the frame already for them tells them that whatever evidence you give to them is simply, false information. You've bought into the conspiracy, or you've been duped. So I would say, first of all, you have to, a little bit anyway, let go of the desire to simply argue the points, although some of that might be necessary. My advice, really quite basically, is to try and get to the root of what the anxiety is that's animating people's desire to hold to these conspiracy theories. So conspiratorial thinking is something that's been with us for a very long time. Some great books about this have been put out there recently. One I would recommend to you, and the name of the author I'm going to forget, but it's called Republic of Lies. It's about conspiracy theories and their uptake in the United States, both presently and historically. It's a really good book from that purpose. And one of the points the author makes is that in a healthy society, conspiracy theories are kind of like origin stories or other myths. They should be fairly easy for a resilient society, a democratic society, to integrate and address, right? They're always going to be with us. We're never going to get rid of all of them, right? And some conspiracy theories are very innocuous, right? They're not all QAnon style stuff. But it's a good indication of the precarious point we're at, that conspiracy theories now seem to spread so virally, so quickly, and pose such a significant challenge to our ability to actually have a decent collective, like empirically based conversation about, what our society should look like, what its problems are, and what kinds of values and norms ought to underwrite it. So again, a lot of this comes from people's feelings of being alienated from each other, from the world, feeling powerless, feeling afraid, feeling incredibly anxious about what the future holds. And conspiracy theories are often one way to answer those kinds of anxieties. They may offer this kind of awful, nightmarish future, but what they do is they often offer like a totalizing, whole cloth story that says you are suffering because of this group of people, because of this thing that's happening, and all you need to do is focus all your attention on this one thing and believe in the great lie, and you'll be fine. And so what I would say is when you're dealing with family members, when you're dealing with loved ones, try to redirect that conversation rather than calling them fools or dupes or idiots, as tempting as that sometimes is. Remember that conspiracy theory is thriving in their lives because they are fundamentally being preyed on by a variety of relations in our society that are endemic to it, that are meant to make us feel insecure, afraid, powerless. That's what capitalism wants as well. It's what white supremacy wants us to believe as well, right? That individually we're kind of nothing, and we have to believe in the structure and those with power and those with greater power than us to lead us to safety. So try to tap into the anxiety. Ask some questions. Oh, okay, well, that seems a little outlandish to me. Like what are you worried about in the world right now? Like what's leading you to this? Well, why do you think that's so appealing? Try to ask them questions that dig down into their motivation for investing so much in these conspiracy theories, because often people who believe in them, they spend a lot of time, a lot of emotional energy pouring them into researching these theories, right? And so I think beginning there and trying to gently point them in other directions. Okay, well, you really think Jews are leading a world government that is aiming to destroy you and your society? Okay, begin by asking the question what you're worried about, but also begin by asking, well, I mean, how reasonable do you think that is, right? Like, do you really think that, like everywhere in every country, in every major organization, there are this shadowy, ethnified group of people who are tapped together? I mean, the unfortunate thing is their answer may well be yes to that, and you have to be prepared for that. Where are you going to go next, right? You can't just call them anti-Semitic. You can't just call them conspiracy theorists or racists and expect them to respond to that. So this is long-term de-radicalization work in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, we live in an age where social media has made this stuff even easier to spread and even easier to sort of insulate yourself from challenges to. So we're dealing with a formidable and complex problem here. I'm going to turn it over to Ajay to see what he has to say about this now.
Yeah. So thinking about that question, I guess the only thing I would add here is to remember, especially anytime you're dealing with your family, if you have the benefit of having a loving relationship with your family, that's one of my greatest privileges in life, is that I come from a very supportive and loving family that doesn't always agree on many things, but we know that we have that foundation. So if you happen to have the privilege of having such a foundation, remind yourself that that's the starting point, and it will help you to be patient where patience is not always immediately forthcoming, especially on things that are so fundamentally irrational. But one of the ways that I try and think about building empathy for family members who subscribe to various forms of conspiracy theories is to think about, or to try to explain it anyway, is to think about the amount of organizational skill that would be necessary to accomplish some collective action project of that magnitude. You know what I mean? Like, probably the closest thing to that in the real world that we have is global capitalism. And I say that not in a rhetorical way. I mean, literally, there are institutions of global capitalism that operate at the international level, such as the World Trade Organization, such as, what's the other one? The International Monetary Fund. There are actual intergovernmental organizations whose task it is to manage various aspects of global capitalism. And what you can see from looking at that example is that they don't do a very good job of it anyway. You know what I mean? So like if even the most powerful and wealthy resources in the world are going towards managing something as ubiquitous as capitalism, and capitalism operates so poorly, the simple collective action skill that would be necessary to coordinate some of these more lavish and outlandish conspiracy theories, it just doesn't seem plausible. So you can try that. That doesn't always work. In which case, I would say, like, know when it's time to tap out of a conversation and try and end the conversation in a speculative way, so that you can then pivot and turn to something else and know that you'll return to a conversation like this in the future. The other thing that you could try, and it depends on the dynamics of your family relationships, is think about trying to find compassionate ways to talk about media literacy. So, and that could be as simple and straightforward as helping to explain to somebody what clickbait is. I've seen this happen. I have a family member who very patiently explained this to another family member, and I'm paraphrasing her here, but basically she said, look, if you have to click 7 or 8 times to read the article and that you feel like something is like, they're waiting to give you the last hook at the end, somebody's making money from each one of those clicks. And that's not how journalism operates. That's not how knowledge, if somebody wants you to know something, that's not the model. Like this model is being created through algorithms and through different ways to get you to perform in a certain way. Maybe don't go down that road too much, because then that starts to sound conspiratorial. Like leave it more basic, like you shouldn't have to click 10 times to get the answer to or the thesis point of an article. And it's weird, because, I come from a tradition of radical grassroots journalism. That's my journalistic investments and background. But in the last few years, I've been making more of a pitch to just mainstream journalism, as a potential way to try and mitigate against this stuff. Opinionated journalism is wonderful, especially when it's clear and they're making their viewpoints known. But what we see right now is that so much, even mainstream journalists don't do that. They pretend that they're unbiased. And when they do that, it further alienates people. And really what is, and this Alex spoke to this too, what's making people feel increasingly alienated and like the world is conspiring against them is how awful and alienated they are in life in advanced industrial capitalism, which of course is fundamentally related to colonialism and fundamentally related to classism as well. Nobody experiences the world through just race. Nobody experiences the world through just gender. So trying to be compassionate with people who are closest to you, and to help them kind of like almost in an ethic of love, like I think about revolutionary love here an awful lot. And it relates a bit to, the question from one question ago, asking us about, the glue that connects society is we kind of have to make that new glue, right? So I think about somebody sitting alone in their bed, doom scrolling and just coming up with these sort of things. And that's a really lonely thing. So, we're in a global pandemic. It's not like you can just call people around, especially those of you who aren't in the Atlantic bubble. Well, I guess there's no bubble, but aren't in this part of the country, but like thinking about ways to connect with them, and try and think about joy, whether it's like playing music, like maybe get together and play some music and let the conversation evolve from there so that people are reminded of the reasons why we have relationships in the first place. And I think that probably more than a lot of other things can go a long way towards convincing people to put away the knives and kind of listen to reason from the people who are closest to them. So that's all I have to say on that. I'll pass it back to you, Alex.
Yeah, great points, AJ. Just, to reiterate that, I think, again, at the risk of, we don't usually follow up on our points here, but I think, remembering that this kind of like widespread belief in conspiracy theory is almost certainly an indication of how desperately fragmented, lonely, worried, our society is right now for a whole variety of reasons, not just the pandemic, right? There is every reason to feel like the status quo has failed us, right? And people will turn to the answers that are most readily to hand. And in some ways, I would say also this is a good reason to remember that those of us who care about living in a collectively liberated society need to also do the work of putting stories out there in an accessible way that convince people that there are alternatives that are humane, that are democratic, that are peaceful, that are not predicated on demonizing and then annihilating a group of people who are identified as being the water carriers for whatever global crisis or local crisis we're currently facing, right? This is precisely why these things need to be intervened in. I mean, I think the thing we have to keep in mind is that conspiracy theorizing is not innocent, right? That it does lead very dark places, and it does fuel actual violence in the real world. So don't leave it. Also, as uncomfortable as it is, I think the points that Ajay is making about this being an act of revolutionary love to intervene and to help people out of this is also your revolutionary and loving obligation to other people who could become victims of your family members should they, follow that rabbit hole all the way down. So let's go to another question here. One that, like is getting asked a lot, I guess, these days as well, given the cycle that we've just come out of. Does voting help advance racial justice? I don't know if I should be spending my time thinking about electoral politics or not. Great question. As a long time anti-authoritarian, I would say that I'm super skeptical and have often not participated in any given election as a voter. Although I voted lots of times too, to be fair. So I'm kind of giving away my answer to this question. I would say voting, like so many other acts in our society, has to be seen not as like a moral choice or and like an essentially good or bad act, but rather something that like is an important like activity in our society, like a potential source of like remediation or acceleration for some of the worst dynamics in our society. And I know some people have described it as like harm reduction behavior, right? That you vote because there are terrible choices out there, and you vote again, not really for the less bad one, but against the really bad one, right? I think all of those things are worth thinking about. But in any case, I would say it's absolutely necessary for people to be at least aware of what's going on in the realm of representative and electoral politics. If you choose not to participate, that's a choice that I think is worth making. But your choice to participate or not shouldn't be based merely on that act. It should be, okay, if I'm going to or I'm not going to, what else am I doing to advance the struggles that I think are important? Because either way, voting in and of itself is not going to change it. So if you choose not to vote and choose not to be invested in electoral politics, then you should be putting those energies and that commitment somewhere else that you believe is actually going to contribute to systemic change in our society. And that can take a whole lot of different forms, right? It certainly doesn't have to take only the form of street protest. In fact, it probably most rarely will take that form, but it may take many of the forms that Ajay has talked about in this session already, right? Having like important, supportive, critical conversations with friends and neighbors and coworkers, like gardening, engaged in your community through doing the work of care that is normally apportioned to people other than yourself. All those are just little examples, but those are all things that make the world a better, more humane, more democratic and just place. But right now, I would say, in all honesty, for people who are sincerely committed to radical social change, I don't think you can afford to ignore the electoral arena. As much as you may not want to, like the question of voting, I'm going to leave aside. Whether you personally head to the polls is a question you need to decide on your own, and the basis for which you might do that. But not being aware of what's at stake in those spaces, I think, is a big mistake right now. First of all, because most people continue to believe in those institutions. So you need to be aware so you can engage, right? Like whether that's critically or supportively or tactically or whatever. If you're not aware, you can't speak to any of those issues. But you also need to be aware of how the ruling class is organizing itself. So, like a good example is the most recent U.S. presidential election. And one way that I understand that election is not that, oh, thank goodness Trump was defeated, now we are all safe with Biden and Harris south of the border, but rather, oh, this is interesting. The U.S. ruling class has reorganized itself once again because it found a certain brand of ruling class character too odious to support, too problematic for too many reasons, and so it's circled the wagons and trying to return to the halcyon days of neoliberal capitalism, which are gone. That's not coming back. So the Biden-Harris regime will confront its own unique challenges in our current context, right? So it's at least important to understand it as a game of musical chairs amongst the ruling class in our society, but more importantly in terms of like providing opportunities. Think of the election cycle as a way that opens up opportunities to have conversations about issues that matter to a lot of people. And that are on people's minds because of the work the political parties are already doing in those moments. So elections aren't good or bad in themselves. They're just another opportunity to be engaged around the things that are coming to people's minds at those times, right? And of course, we should be engaged in between those times. That goes without saying. But thinking about electoral politics that way, I think is really useful. Thinking about it as a strategic location, thinking about it as an important pivot of power in our society, and trying to understand how that works and how those things might make a difference. And indeed, sometimes there are decent and progressive candidates, rarely radical ones, but sometimes decent and progressive candidates to be supportive. And here's where I'd say put in a plug, especially for municipal politics, where it's not organized according to our conventional three political parties at the federal level, really two, right? In terms of who's able to win a federal election. And instead, you have a variety of issues that touch people's lives directly. City councilors control municipal budgets, lots of initiatives that could make people's lives much better immediately at the level of your municipality get decided at that level. So we are often drawn towards, the big elections for who's going to run the whole country. But think also about, how those politics are influencing your life at that level, and have important conversations with people around you in those moments about the issues that are getting raised or not. Over to you, Ajay.
Yeah, thanks. The voting question. Here's the thing. Okay, here's what I think about voting. If you only have capacity in your life to do one little thing, don't make it voting. You know what I mean? Like if you only have time for one thing, don't make it voting. But the thing is about just simply voting, it doesn't really take any time, right? You can do it in like 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes or something like that. So I always say vote without faith. The revolution isn't going to happen because you voted one way or the other. If you look at the incentive structures facing how formal political parties compete with one another, they are programmed for conservatism. And I should say that meaning small-scale conservatism, gradual change. And we need change to happen much more quickly than that. And there are other ways that make things happen quickly, right? And I'm going to use one example from here in Chibouctouc in Halifax that I think has been really neat. I haven't seen it talked about or analyzed in the news in this way yet, but there's a group of dedicated activists. I don't know if they vote. Probably some of them do. Probably some of them don't. But they just started building shelters, just building them, because they don't want people who don't have access to shelter to freeze in the cold. They are not up to code. They are not, like there's lots of like logistical bureaucratic problems with them. But they have some of them that are already built and put up on private property, public property. And what's been amazing about this is that on the one hand, some people have been able to live in these shelters and find some relief. On the other hand, it has forced municipal council to talk about this in municipal council, to come out and into the public and say, these are inadequate housing situations, but then, well, okay, then provide one. You know what I mean? So now they're talking about that. They have catalyzed the conversation through simply bringing people together to do a political project in spite of mainstream politics and in spite of building codes and in spite of all the various rules that would tell you don't do that. So, I think personally, in my own opinion, doing projects like that should take your first level effort. And then if you have 20 minutes to go and vote on election day, go and do that. And this isn't until, like Alex said, sometimes there are really great candidates, and that's wonderful. But one other thing that formal electoral politics might offer you is actually an avenue through which to talk to people who are less engaged in politics in your life. Because the mainstream media goes absolutely berserk anytime there's an election of any kind, right? So your family members, your friends, people who are maybe otherwise not at all engaged might be open to hearing a political argument, So they might be open to hearing why, life under a conservative government is worse for most people than life under whatever other government you might prefer to support. Like I have cards on the table. I systematically and fundamentally despise the Conservative Party of Canada. I don't mind telling you that. So I think that their policies have been comprehensively bad for progressive politics in this country in lots of insidious ways. That doesn't mean that I have any love for any of the other parties, but it does mean that I find life to be more bearable under another party that is not the Conservative Party because of their ideological foundations and the things that they value. You may feel the same way about something else. So there's no harm in using that as a way to talk about something deeper in terms of imagining a better society. So I'll just leave it at that, and we can go on, Alex.
Yeah, very, very nicely said, I think. All right, folks, we're actually rounding the turn here to our last few minutes of our session. So I would probably have time for one, maybe two more questions. I'm just letting you know. We'll see how we go for time, and then AJ will wrap us up and send us out. So the next question is another doozy. How can I approach someone in my life who seems to be going down an incel path? Should I? So for those of you who are not familiar, incel refers to involuntarily celibate, this primarily online, I just like to call it a movement, like an identity, a grievance politics animated by almost exclusively younger men who feel that women, as a consequence of feminism and other innovations, are turning them down for the sex that is rightfully theirs. That should be them. Their access to women's sexuality and their bodies is denied to them, and it has enraged them. I'm sure it doesn't come as a surprise if you've been paying any attention to the news over the last few years that incels have engaged in acts of terror in Canada and elsewhere, and as somebody who studies the far right in some of its most militarized forms, I can also say that incels often are some of the people who are most drawn towards what's typically called like lone wolf terrorism, right? So they don't require the traditional mechanisms of being radicalized. So most people who come to sort of involvement in these kinds of politics have to meet other people, spend time with them, they train together, they do all this kind of stuff, think about kind of a traditional sort of terrorist group. Incels actually are almost exclusively radicalized online and in isolation. I mean, you can see why, right? Their sense of being cut off, their sense of being denied this women's sexuality and sexual labor is connected to their alienation, right? So they're like profoundly disconnected people often, and extremely filled with grievance around that. I would say it's very important for you to engage those people. If you have a sense that there's a man in your life who is heading down an incel path, that should be a sign like they're reading a bomb making manual online. In all honesty, that is a path of grievance politics. That's the same as the same kind of level of intensity as really virulent race hatred, really virulent anti-Semitism. It leads people very quickly to enact actual violence in the world. So obviously you want to do it carefully. Obviously you want to do it with support. Obviously you want to do it with a degree of empathy for the person as well. But most importantly, you want to do it clearly with them and to make it an intervention that basically creates a fire break between their sense of grievance and the people that they will then take it out on. Incel ideology, I think, also needs to be understood as a bit of a gateway onto other far-right forms of belief, including rabid forms of racism. Lots of men have come to far-right activism through incel politics, or less politics, more ideology. It's not particularly a politics in that sense. It doesn't prescribe solutions. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there to make sure AJ has a chance to jump in here.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. I mean, I really don't have much to add to that. The incel point, I think Alex is exactly right. You need to think of it as basically terrorist training groups. So in terms of should you depends on whether or not you have the capacity. So I'll just focus on that should you, because it's not easy to talk to somebody who's part of a radical movement, but like Alex said, if they are not yet, it's important for you to be able to show them that there are other doors to walk through, because the dark web, the internet, etc., is doing everything that it can to pull people in that direction, and they have all these various icons and people in their I'm loath to call it a movement, but in their sphere that to model themselves on and speak to what is I think genuinely the smallness of their understanding of the world. So the ways that I would try to help people see the world differently here, I teach international development studies, and one of the things that I hate the most about international development studies is the way people tend to look at the material inequity around the world and be like, oh, look, things are so bad in this place. But this might be one of those opportunities where, at least at the baseline level, be like, listen, not to make little of your struggles, but there are people who are really struggling in other parts of the world. So this is not where you need your hat. There are other things. But yeah, I'm not the most empathetic to this. So I think follow Alex's advice on here. I'll pass it back to Alex.
All right. I think maybe we have time to squeeze in one more question for this session. If AJ and I take a minute to answer, and then we throw it to AJ for the wrap up. How do I talk to family members who know nothing about settler colonialism, and anti-Black racism? Wow. Well, this is, I think, a basic education piece, right? So how do you talk to people about any issue that you know something about that they know nothing about, whether that's internal combustion engine repair or martial arts, your favorite band or sports team? You have to find an in their own lives, and you have to present them with information that is accessible, intelligible, and elementary enough that they're able to get their feet wet and get a sense of what they don't know and how much more they need to learn without feeling like you are demeaning them or being patronizing. So that's not an easy balance to strike, but there are lots of good resources out there. I'd say, one way to start with a lot of people is if they like to read a little bit too. There's some wonderful works of fiction and historical nonfiction also out there that introduce people to this in really readable ways, right? Something contemporary I'd highly recommend would be Desmond Cole's book, The Skin We're In. Such a good book, so readable, so accessible, introducing people to the nature and character of anti-Black racism and Black life in Canada right now. So just think about what you can do to open the door for them onto these topics in a way that invites them and excites them to learn more, rather than in a way that demeans them or condemns them for not already being educated. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. So I'll answer this, and then I'll kind of wrap us up for this session. It reminds me, so we get questions like this sometimes, and Alex and I have talked about this in previous sessions, but I think we're going to find some time in the coming weeks and months to put our heads together and maybe put together a reading list. That would be really useful in terms of, like, base level education on this sort of thing. We did it a few times ago where we just started showing you like pictures of the books that we love, so you can go into an archive and check that out. But basically, I would say my strategy here is always try and find a point in your family's lived experience, some place where they have been wronged unjustly. Build from that, because the first point, I think, is having the empathy. They need to learn the empathy to understand the fundamental unfairness of intersections like anti-Black racism and settler colonialism. Because my assumption is most people are good people. Most people don't want to believe that they are part of a project of systematic racism. And yet we all are, as a function of being, part of settler colonial Canada. So if you can start from the point of this is a really unfair thing that you experienced one time. So that you didn't feel good about that, and this wasn't something that you deserved. Now let's try and scale back and think about that at a much larger level, whether that be, the history of slavery in Canada or settler colonial, and you can pick and choose things that you think, based on your knowledge of the family member, things that they might be sympathetic to. If they're an environmentalist, for example, then maybe think about, something that might relate to land and nature and conservation. So that'll be the entry point. More on that will come when we put together that reading list. So I just wanted to thank you all for coming and hitting us up with these really thought-provoking questions. I hope that this was useful to you, and that you'll share this video with some of these family members that you mentioned. And I'd encourage you to follow. Big thanks to Fernwood again for hosting this. And if you want to stay up to date with each event, you can follow the Fernwood YouTube channel. Check us out on Facebook, all that good stuff. And we will be back here again a month from now on the last Wednesday of February. I believe that's the 24th. From 12:30 to 1:30, that's our slot. So send in your questions ahead of time, send them in live, and we'll see you again next month. Thanks so much.